we're going to be going over how you as a non-technical, self-funded, possibly first-time software founder can actually go ahead and step over and avoid the common mistakes and pitfalls that most first-time non-technical founders fall into when building a software product, right? As I'm sure you know at this point, doing your research and just looking around, this is not the most safe option for going ahead and building a new product, or if you're already a business owner, building a new product in your business, or if you're not a business owner yourself, stepping into business. There's a lot of different pitfalls that people tend to fall into. But with that being said, there are ways to go ahead and mitigate those risks and set yourself up for the best possible chance of success with going with that. So before we get into this more so in depth, right, I want to lay out exactly who this information is for, who it's best suited to help, right? So essentially, this is what we have here, a timeline that goes over kind of in a little bit of a bird's eye view, what the steps are for building a successful software product or a successful MVP, right? When I say MVP, what I'm referring to is a minimum viable product. Essentially, when you're building the software, the very first thing that you want to do is, as opposed to building the entire thing out, right? Essentially, your entire vision can be very, very broad, which is a good thing, especially as a founder. You're supposed to be very ambitious and have very large ideas. But Rome wasn't built in one day, right? Take the example of Facebook or Instagram, right? When Instagram first launched, it was just an application where you could share photos. It was very, very bare bones. Obviously, today they have voice call, video calling, send notes, reels, things of that nature. But the MVP is, like I said, the minimum viable product, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So for the timeline, you have to have an idea, right? Of course, I'm someone who's obviously I come from a development background, software engineering. I'm not going to be able to give you an idea for your own industry. So you need to have an idea to the table to go from there. If you don't have an idea, there's obviously tons of resources. You check out my Instagram, check out just YouTube in general, and just look up how you can go ahead and generate ideas. But for today, we're going to be assuming that you have an idea going into this. Once you have that idea, you need to have funds, right? So obviously, if you're someone who's non-technical, you can't develop your own software. Myself, like I said, I've come from an engineering background. I've been developing software since I was 15 years old, so I know how to develop software. So for my scenario, and anyone who's technical or has a technical co-founder who has the time and availability to code, you don't need the funds. But if you don't have a co-founder, you don't have a development background, you do need to have funds to be able to pay for technical individuals like developers, designers, etc., to go ahead and build the MVP of your project. Right now, what I have here, 10K plus, is on the low end as far as what you would need. Obviously, like I said, depending on the idea and the complexity, that can go up or down. But just to be safe, you want to have at least $10,000 in cash and funds, right, to be able to invest for your software. So right off the bat, if you don't have these two things right now, this information that we're going to talk about today is not suited for you. So I would say, definitely click off the video and do your own research as far as how you can go ahead and find an idea. And then once you have that idea, gathering your funds and being at a point where you're able to go ahead and have an actionable game plan to build out your software. So once we have those two things down, right, the first thing you need post that is a plan, right? It's one of the biggest things that you see derail software founders, right, especially the first time, especially non-technical, is that they go into it without a plan, and a lot of different things, all the things that can go wrong do go wrong for them, right? Different features come up that end up being, very bloated, the scope gets very large, the cost, of course, and timelines get large as well. So it's important to have a very, very tangible and attackable plan before going into the development. Now, once we have that plan, the next step is to go ahead and build the software, of course, the MVP. Now, when I say build, that encompasses everything, right? Designs and Figma. We'll get into what that looks like in a little bit, but also the actual technical aspect of it as well, right? The code, database, microservices, all those different things. From there, the launch, right? So obviously one of the most important parts with any type of business, software included, is you need users, you need traffic, right? So building it is one thing, launching it and getting marketing, doing the sales, that's a whole different scenario. That's also very, very important. And then from there, scaling and going beyond, right? So let's talk about right now some of the common misconceptions, the common pitfalls with developing software, why they occur, and how, there's a certain system, what we call our blueprint system here at Benmore Technologies, that we can use to actually go ahead and mitigate a lot of those risks to decrease the cost of developing an MVP, decrease the risk of developing the MVP, and also make sure that the vision of the founder, which would be you, is aligned and protected throughout the entire process. So when talking about the common mistakes that most, first-time non-technical software founders face, number one that I see often is actually a misdiagnosis of the problem. So a lot of times, I'll give an analogy, right? Imagine you have some symptoms of an illness. Maybe you have a sore throat or a runny nose, or maybe you have some joint pain. something of that effect. What you don't want to do is go straight to solutions without understanding the underlying cause, right? And what we do here at Benmore is really understand before we get into any development, we want to be able to diagnose the problem correctly, right? Now, in a more tangible sense, what that means is that as opposed to going straight to the how and the what, you need to first understand the why, right? So most people, when they have a software idea, the very first thing they'll do is they'll think, okay, how can I go ahead and find developers, right? How can I find a developer for cheap to be able to build this thing for me? Or how can I find a development company, right? Now, when it comes to finding a developer or a development company, those are things that you can do and find success in. Now, the question really is that the correct thing to do at this stage? Especially when you've gone from someone who's been in the stage where you have the idea, you have the funds. The next step is not to build, right? This is a misdiagnosis of the problem. The next step is to understand why we want to build, right? Why are we building? For example, the medical example I just laid out, right? The last thing that you want to do is go straight to medicine and start taking different medicines. You need to understand what the actual problem is and do a proper diagnosis, right? So what that looks like is actually having what's called a requirements elicitation period, where as opposed to talking about, how many developers, what tech stacks, we're talking about why is this problem worth solving, right? That's the first question. Why is it worth solving by you? Second question. And why is it worth solving now? If you look at different interviews by startup accelerators like Y Combinator, you hear a common theme from kind of what they say about the different ideas that they commonly turn away. And one of those is there's no impetus, there's no reason why that problem should be solved by that specific founder at this specific time, right? So, one example I can give to you is that, say you were someone in the real estate profession, right? You had, maybe different rental properties or something like that, and you saw that there's a problem in your space. It would not behoove you to go ahead and try to solve, a different problem that you may or may not have a lot of experience in, right? So, example, if you were in that real estate profession and you said, hey, let's go ahead and build this, medical tech software that solves, different problems in the medical space, when you yourself don't have any experience for that problem. At the end of the day, software is a game of any business really is a game of competition, right? So you're not best suited to solve that problem compared to somebody else who has a lot more experience in that space, right? So it's really, really important to understand the why, right? Like I said, why you and why now, right? You need to have a very good understanding of those two questions and understand why those are the case. Now, once you've gone ahead and got past that first mistake, which is the largest one I see, people typically fall into this mistake now, right? So what people don't understand about the software development space is that there are a lot of different ways to actually go ahead and have your software idea built out. The three main ways are as follows. I'll rank them as far as how people typically go about it. The first one is working with an individual or freelancer who is a software developer, right? A full stack developer. Typically people will have or hire one full stack developer from, let's say, Upwork or Fiverr, from these different developing countries like India, the Philippines, Pakistan, things of that nature. That's the first and most popular way. The second way is to use a software development company, maybe like ours or like someone else's. There's different software development companies out there that specialize in different things. The third way is to actually go ahead and find a co-founder or a CTO and give equity to that person, or maybe equity and a salary type of mix for them to build out the software. Now, what a lot of people who are self-funding their startup don't do and don't realize is that there are actually trade-offs and benefits for each of these different aspects, and there are risks and rewards that are according to those different trade-offs. So for the first role, right, for people who are actually going to freelance or outsource their development to a freelancer, we can actually go ahead and look at this illustration that outlines what that relationship looks like for both the freelancer model and the development company model. When going with a freelancer, there is an inherent risk that's involved with someone who's a little bit lower in cost, right? So you might be able to find someone from India or from, let's say, any of those developing countries or places like that, even, the Western world, like, the US or Canada, to go ahead and build out this software for you for, let's say, 5 to 7, 8K, right? Now with that, it seems like a very attractive route. And a lot of times it is because, don't let people fool you and tell you that people from developing countries are worse at developing software than people from the US. It's just not true. But the issue is that a lot of times there is a missing link as far as communication that derails those projects. I'll get into more of what that looks like in a little bit. But just for now, what people will typically do is they'll have an idea, they'll go ahead and find a freelancer and actually go ahead and outsource the coding to that individual. But the risk here lies in the fact that a lot of times, and we see it all the time in our company, people will come to us and and say, hey, I went ahead and spent, $5, $10, $20,000 with this freelancer, but it's not quite correct. I had to go ahead and restart, and now, I'm 20K in the hole now, and I'm going ahead and doing it all over again. So the risk here is that the cost is actually a hidden cost. It typically isn't 100% success rate, and so people will go ahead and spend multiple times of what the cost initially was to get it to a point where it's actually satisfactory, right? So that's that inherent risk. On the other hand, you're working with large development companies, and what you're typically paying for is the brand, right? So these companies have been around for a long time. They have a catalog of different companies that they work with doing various things, and a lot of times what they'll also do is they'll try to actually sell you on not quite the MVP. Because like I said, the most important part when starting a software company is to start small, like I said earlier with that Instagram example, and to iterate based on market feedback, right? But what a lot of these companies will do is they'll hear your entire idea, the entirety of it, right? And go ahead and build out everything and give you a quote for what all it would include, right? Not to say that that's a bad thing. It's more so kind of a preference as far as how you want to go about it. But at Benmore, what we like to focus on is, like I said, building software in a risk-adverse manner so we can decrease costs and decrease risk. That's kind of not the way that we roll. But when you do that, you're going to head and see a very large quote for development, right? I think, minimum you'll typically see is like 100K, all the way up to, seven figures for these development companies. Now, with that being said, like I said, people have a misunderstanding of the development landscape. And so they'll either go with a high risk, low cost individual or a high cost, lower risk development company where they're getting good service, but it may not be appropriate for where they're at and what they're looking to do. Especially when you're coming out of pocket as someone who's a self-funded founder, you're not someone who has a venture capital backing, you have, millions of dollars in funds to go ahead and play with. This is typically either your capital or maybe some grants or some loans that you've acquired. Now, moving on to number 3, what typically derails a lot of individuals is a lack of technical knowledge, right? This is with any of these two routes, like either the high cost, low risk route with these software development companies or the low cost, high risk route with these individual freelancers. The reason why a lot of people end up not being able to get the actual end product that they're getting, whether that be they ran out of money with a freelancer or a development company, or just ended up the product wasn't exactly what they envisioned. A lot of that issue is because you yourself, you have an idea based on your industry expertise, what you've seen in the markets and all of that, and you have kind of this end vision in your head for what it might look like, feel like, and be able to accomplish for the user, but you're missing the gap in between to be able to say, okay, we're at point A, we need to get to point B. This is the bridge, technically, right? We need to build a software that does this. It has these different connections to the different services, different APIs, maybe payment processing, scheduling, events, messaging, these different things. Most people don't have the actual technical knowledge and background to be able to speak and translate their idea effectively to a technical personnel. And so with that, there typically is a lot of guesswork. One way that I actually like to imagine it is like playing a game of telephone with your friends. I'm not sure, maybe growing up, if you ever played the game of telephone, how it works is that you have, let's say, you have a phrase. You start with a phrase, right? Let's say the phrase was, I like spaghetti, right? And you have, let's call it, 5 or 10 different people playing the game with you. And what you do is that you say the phrase, you whisper it to your friend, and you say, hey, I like spaghetti. And then go ahead and pass it along all the way back to you, right? Now, by the time it gets back to you, typically is not what you said in the first place. It might be something like in the Serengeti or something like that, right? It's typically been misunderstood or translated and mistranslated on time and time again. So the time it comes to you, it's not what you originally wanted to hear. This is the same issue in the software development space, especially for people like yourself who are non-technical and lack that technical knowledge, is that when you're communicating with a developer, right, especially if you went with the freelancer route and you have one developer on your team who's full stack developer, when you communicate to that developer, there's only one point of failure, right? So if that communication is not top notch, up to par with, correct technical terms, correct documentation, all of that, if that communication is not up to par, what's going to happen is that they're going to think one thing and you're going to think something completely different in your head. Imagine that you're getting a house built and you said to someone who's a builder, right? I want to go ahead and build, a 3-story house with 4 rooms, 2.5 bathrooms, all of that, right? You said that, but without the technical diagrams, without the schematics, the blueprints, the renderings, right? And then you said, hey, off to the races. I'm giving you your first payment. Go ahead and build it for me. I'll give you the rest when it's done. With that situation, right? Now the individual who's building it, in their head, they have an idea of what it is you said, right? Based on their past experiences, all of that. But the question here is that, are those two images the same, right? And typically they're not. just because, like I said, there only is that one point of failure as far as that verbal or maybe even written communication. So lacking that technical knowledge is a very, very big issue as far as why a lot of projects get derailed and why a lot of them never make it to see the light of day. Now, the fourth common mistake that we see is that typically people will not have any project management background. And so why I was pinpointing and kind of highlighting when people typically go with this high risk, low cost route is that they typically would go with hiring just one full stack developer. Now, the fact of the matter is, especially for someone who's non-technical, developing software is not a job for one developer. It's in the name, right? Software development, as far as like you have an idea, you want to get it developed, but there are more supporting roles to that if you want to ensure that your product is getting correctly developed. Right, the very first thing is you need to have a product designer, right? So what a designer is someone who's able to actually go ahead and take your idea, right? Take kind of the different users that are going to be interacting with it, to the different features that are going to be able to be on the software and create the actual designs in front end. A designer is very, very important to be able to map out essentially all the different screens of the software, and they can be done very, very quickly and very inexpensively compared to a full stack developer, right? Because they're not doing any of the coding, using no code tools to be able to do illustrations essentially. That way you have a visual as to what they understand your idea to be before you invest all that money into development and all that time, right? Essentially, for someone to create a design of a different screen, let's say for example a dashboard, right? For a designer to design the designs for the dashboard, it could take them, let's call it 1 unit of time, right? But for a developer to design and build that same dashboard, it might take 5-10x that same amount of time, right? So, and of course time is money as well. So it's important to actually have the designs for your software done before going to development, right? That's because, like I said with the dashboard example, even if they have to redo it 2 or 3 times, they're spending 1 unit of time per iteration. So at the worst case, it's 3, which is, at the very best case for a developer, it beats their 10. Right? If a developer designs a dashboard and builds it out fully, right, that's 10 units of time to the designer's 1, right? That's obviously an example, but the same is true in reality. On top of that, if you yourself are not someone who has a background in product management, you might also need a project manager to make sure that the developer, the designer, whoever else on the project is doing things and actually creating these different features in a time-efficient manner, that the project is actually being managed correctly. Because one of the biggest things that we see that derails a lot of software projects is scope creep, right? And what scope creep is, at the beginning of the project, you have a set amount of features that you're committing to building for the software, right? But as time goes on, you think, hey, this would be a good idea to add as well. Let's add this, let's add that, right? And then all these different aspects of the software go ahead and increase the overall scope to the point where nothing ever gets released, nothing ever gets done. The only thing that happens is that timelines get expanded and your wallet gets thinner and thinner and thinner as time goes on. Now, moving forward to our 5th and final point, right? Imagine you're able to actually go ahead and avoid all these other pitfalls, right? You've gone from idea, you have your funds, you've planned it out, you've built out the MVP with, let's say, a freelancer or even a development company. The issue that a lot of people run into at this point is that they have a lack of adequate support to be able to go ahead and take on market feedback and go ahead and build out a more robust project once the MVP has been built. So in software development, there's almost 2 completely distinct phases for how things are getting done. Right, that very first phase of going 0 to 1 is when you have essentially you have your idea, but you're pre-product and you're pre-launch. Right, so in that phase, there's no external stimuli that's putting a stressor on your system. Right, essentially you're able to take your time for the most part. Right, bar any news or market shifts that come during that time. But for the most part, you're able to just rely on, let's say, a freelancer or who may have a full-time job on top of that, or a development company who has different projects that they're working on to build your product, because there's no external stimuli coming into your system. Right, things are typically very safe, typically very predictable in this stage. Right, if you've gone through and avoided all these common mistakes that we just laid out. Right, but as soon as you actually go ahead and launch that product, right, as soon as you've gone ahead and crossed that Rubicon into your product is now in a live environment with users on it, traffic getting thrown at it, you're now in a totally different ballgame. Right, you need to have, and this is our philosophy at Benmore Technology, is that if you are a software company, right, not a tech-enabled company, but it's a company who has a core product, which is software, right, you need to have your own software developers. There's 0 examples of successful software companies that do not employ software engineers, right? It's just not a thing. And the reason for that is because in software, the name of the game is speed. Essentially, if you're building an MVP, you need to be operating off the assumption that you are wrong, right? Like the whole point of software is not to be right, it's to get to a point where you're less and less wrong as time goes on, as quickly as possible. This is what's called feedback loops. Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, goes ahead and talks about this a lot. But the core concept here is that if you have two different companies who have the same initial product in the same space, let's call it company one and company two, right? Company one has no software developers on staff. They're using an agency or development company or even freelancers, and it takes them 2 weeks to iterate feedback from the market. Right, so every time they have feedback from the market, they have to go ahead and wait on schedules or whatever the case may be, and it takes them 2 weeks to iterate and get to that improvement, right? That might be a bug fix that needs to occur, a feature request, things of that nature, right? Now, company two employs, let's say, a team of, let's say a very small team of 1 to 2 to 3 developers, and so it takes them 2 days to implement these different requests because they have a fully dedicated team of full-time engineers to be able to do so. Right, so who do you think is going to win overall? Right, it takes someone 2 weeks versus 2 days. The person who has those smaller feedback loops in the same market, right, with the same initial product, is going to get closer and get less wrong 7 times faster than company one. That means that their product is going to evolve to a point where it actually fits exactly what the market is looking for, which is called product market fit, 7 times faster than company one, right? And especially in a business like software, which a lot of times can be winner take all markets, you need to be able to operate off speed once you've gone ahead and launched your product, right? Like I said earlier, in that initial phase, 0 to 1, you can go ahead and kind of take your time, and especially if you're being a little bit more risk adverse, like we advise our clients to be, you can definitely take your time. But once you have that product launched, it's very important to be able to operate in very fast feedback loops, right? All the best, all the most popular, and all the most successful software founders, like I said, Sam Altman, Mark Zuckerberg, all these multi-billionaires are saying the exact same thing in that regard, is that feedback loops are the most important aspect of building software. Because like I said, you need to accept that off the bat. You are wrong. The point of the game is to be less wrong as time goes on, as fast as possible. So now we've laid out 5 of the most common mistakes and pitfalls that first-time, non-technical, bootstrapping and self-funding founders like yourself typically fall into. I want to go ahead and address the actual solutions for this and why my company, Benmore Technologies, is organized in a way to actually tackle these problems head on. Now, before I get into how my company is set up to actually solve these problems for our clients, I want to let you know that this is what we do. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to work with us to achieve these same goals, right? This is a methodology that really anyone could follow. It's very, very simple and very streamlined. And if you are willing and able to go ahead and follow this yourself, you do not need to work with my company or any other company for that matter to plan, build, and launch your software in a very risk-averse and safe way that sets you up for the most probable success, right? Now, with that being said, typically people do like to work with us for this very reason, because we actually lay out the exact steps. We're very transparent with that. And we have a lot of experience doing so ourselves. So it takes the burden off of our clients and allows both parties to do what they're best at, right? The founder is one with a lot of industry experience who has a great idea. We're the ones who have to kill the process and the talent in-house to be able to go ahead and carry out that vision. So with that being said, I want to give some context as to exactly why we do this, right? Our mission statement is to provide startups and small businesses with rapid MVP software development services in a consistent, documented, and risk-averse manner. Like we just went over, there are a lot of pitfalls that people are not aware of when building a software. And so it's important to have a very documented and systematized way to go ahead and avoid all these 5 most common pitfalls so that our clients and people in general are not falling into the same traps over and over and wasting more time, wasting more money. As we get into this, one of my favorite pastimes is bragging about some of the things that our team has been able to accomplish and some of our team's experience, but I won't bore you too much with that today. So like I mentioned, the very first and most common problem that people typically face is a misdiagnosis of the problem, right? Like I said, people will typically have an idea and go straight into going ahead and figuring out how to build out that idea without doing any questioning as to if that is the best way to build that idea. At a more root level, should that idea be built in the first place by you? So before we do any of that, right, what we like to do is go ahead and do a comprehensive market research and market analysis to understand the answers to these questions, right? A lot of times, and I'll just be transparent, people come to us with different ideas and our team goes ahead and says, okay, let's take it all in to hear what you have to say. And then based off the research, things might be uncovered whereby the correct direction might not be that original idea, right? We have the market data to back that up, and we'll be able to give our own professional recommendation as to exactly what the next step should look like if we're going ahead and staying true to our mission statement, which is building risk-averse MVPs. Now, of course, with that being said, at the end of the day, you are the founder, right? So if you want to go ahead and kind of just go ahead and do your own thing, that's totally up to you. Our job is to just facilitate and help you do that. Like I said, we do have our expertise and our research to back up kind of our claims there, but at the end of the day, you are the founder and you have the impetus to be able to do kind of what you want to do. So how it works is that the very first thing we'll do is just meet with the solutions team to just get a sense of exactly what your idea is, right? Essentially just having you kind of word vomit, idea vomit onto us and just get a sense of your vision, kind of how you've envisioned it from the start, what your background is. Just get a sense from a very bird's eye view what that looks like, so that from there we can actually go ahead and do our own market research and understand the why, right? Like I said, understand the actual diagnosis for the problem as opposed to different solutions and skipping that initial first step, right? So that takes about a week for our team to go ahead and do the research, figure out what the competitors look like, the market sentiment, different statistics to just back up or just prove your initial claim, and then kind of go from there and give you our formal recommendation as to whether or not we should pursue the idea as is, or maybe tweak it in certain aspects, maybe pivot it, and kind of just have that initial conversation. Now, if you remember what we talked about earlier, one of the other big issues that we see is a lack of technical knowledge, and that leads to kind of that telephone that we said earlier that happens, right? Now, to mitigate that, what we'll do is we have our own in-house team of UI UX designers who use Figma to go ahead and create these different screens, these different flows based off your initial describing of the idea, right? So how that works is that you'll sit down with our head of design, and they'll essentially get a sense of kind of the different aspects that you want to include in the UI UX of the software, right? What are the color schemes, the fonts, logos? If you don't have those, we'll be able to create those for you. That way, once we're going ahead and creating the designs, we have a sense as to what it's supposed to look like, but at the same time, we're giving our expertise about how those different aspects of the design will go ahead and influence and impact the end product, right? Like I said, our job here is to build a risk-averse MVP. So sometimes that means, let's actually go ahead and not add this design feature, this design element, because it's going to actually increase the cost of development or increase timelines or make things more complex. Different scenarios like that actually do affect what things typically end up looking like that you might not know in the beginning. Now, we also have our own proprietary client portal that utilizes a lot of AI to go ahead and synthesize your project requirements. So essentially, what we'll be able to do here is have, like I said earlier, multiple points of truth to be able to point to and look at as to what the definition of your product is supposed to be. Like I mentioned earlier, the last thing you want to do is have just one point of truth, which is communication verbally to a developer or just through messages like emails. You want to have different aspects that point to exactly what it is we're talking about. So we have different documents, we have video recordings, we have user requirements, we have the MVP features, user stories, third-party API specification, database schema, technical document requirement, and also the technical requirements document, right? These are all technical documents that point to and outline exactly what we're looking to build from a technical perspective, so that once the actual developers go ahead and look at that, they'll know without a doubt exactly what the actual software is supposed to be, as opposed to you just telling them, hey, I want to build an app that does XYZ, and they only know at a very surface level what it is you're looking for. So this, combined with the Figma designs, essentially acts as insurance to what your idea is supposed to be, because it outlines it and kind of paints it in a picture that technical personnel can actually understand and know exactly what your idea and your vision is supposed to be. Now, from there, we'll be able to present an actual quote for the development of the project, right? Like I mentioned earlier, the last thing you want to do is go into a project without yourself and your team knowing exactly what it is you're looking to build, right? Like I mentioned earlier, our goal is to actually go ahead and build out risk-averse software MVPs for our clients. So throughout this entire process of discovery, what we're doing is advising you on how to go ahead and decrease your overall scope to make sure that your quote and your timeline is as appropriate as possible, right? In some cases, different ideas require a larger initial scope for it to be minimally viable than others. So the quote and the timeline could be higher than other cases where the software idea is very simple and it can be built out quickly for a very low amount. But our entire goal here is to go through those initial steps so that when we get to this actual quote, it's not necessarily a prescription, but it's more so the opening of a conversation to say, hey, this is what you described your idea to us as, right? This is how we understand it. We've documented everything as far as the different aspects, the different features, and the design. Based off of those, this is what that will cost, right? Now from here, we'll have a conversation about, do we need to include all the various different aspects of the software? The best way I can describe it is that, with a software, there's different buckets to where features and requests fall into, right? On one side, we have high priority. One side, we have medium priority. And the other side, we have low priority, right? So, ideally, you want to be an appropriate split of features for what you're looking to do, right? For an MVP, you want most of the features to be high priority things as opposed to low priority. Those things can be handled later on, but if we're looking for a split, ideally you want 60% to be in high priority, 30% to be in medium, and then 10% to be in low priority, right? But if we go through this entire process with you and we figure out, based on everything you're throwing at us and talking about in those initial stages, that 50% is low priority, 30% is medium, and 20% is high, then at this point, we're giving you that quote, we're able to outline and kind of give our recommendation as to how to tweak the overall scope of the project to more so fit it in a place where it's very, very risk adverse and you're not adding a lot of fluff to the overall dev code. Like I mentioned earlier, our goal is to build that risk adverse MVP so that we're not wasting a ton without having that feedback from the market to give us the actual direction to what should be built. And the reason for that is, like I mentioned, we are wrong, right? Especially when you have no feedback, no users, your initial assumptions, you can assume them to be wrong. They're just wrong, right? So if we're going to be wrong, we should be wrong for the least amount of money, the least amount of time invested as possible. That way, once we have actual feedback from the market, we can go ahead and iterate that and be less wrong as time goes on and iterate faster with actual feedback to guide our direction. Now, once we're in development, our team uses the agile development methodology to manage projects. So if you're familiar with that, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. If you're not, it's just the industry standard way of managing development projects. So things are rolled out in a very predictable manner. Now from there, like I mentioned, our whole goal is to help you build out that MVP in a risk-averse manner, while overarching having the idea that all software companies should have their own software developers, right? So like I mentioned earlier, there's those two different phases, right? That pre-product, pre-launch phase where there's no external stimuli, right? That's what we're going to be able to help you do, right? That 0 to 1 phase is the most risky phase of any software project because, there's things that could happen. Like I said, all these different common mistakes that happen to derail people in that stage. We're going to be able to help you get rid of all of those different things because we have the experience and the system to be able to do that. Now, from there, once you go ahead and launch your software to the market, there's going to be actual load on that software, and you want to have individuals on your team who are dedicated to 40 hours per week to be able to handle those things, right? So at this point, we're talking about right now, what we're going to be able to help you do once we're at the point where the MVP has been developed is that we're going to be able to sit down with you and understand exactly what the next steps are for your situation, right? Everyone's situation is a little bit different, but like I mentioned, every software company should have their own software engineers dedicated to them 40 hours per week to be able to implement new changes based on market feedback. So from here, what we'll do is allocate one of our team members onto your project full time to be able to grow with you. And as you grow, help you allocate more and more team members to meet that demand and meet that load. Now, like I originally mentioned, this is our process, is how we're able to go ahead and mitigate all these common mistakes that people typically run into when building a software, but you don't have to work with us to do these things, right? If you want to go ahead and implement all these different things on your own, you can go ahead and do so. All this information is out there for you to go ahead and research. Now, that is an option, but it will take a lot of investment as far as time and effort on your end, right? Like I mentioned, I've been developing software since I was 15 years old, and our team has a lot of experience, over 100 years of combined back-end experience developing software and managing projects. And so if this is something that you're looking to do as far as having a more experienced team, go ahead and help you navigate these waters and build out your MVP in a risk-averse manner while decreasing costs and increasing the actual efficiency of your time and your money, then you can definitely go ahead and book a call with my team if you haven't already. And we can walk you through what this looks like in more detail as far as your specific application and how things might play out for your project. Now, with that being said, this call is free. And if you haven't got ahead and scheduled a free call with my team, you can actually go ahead and do so with the link in the description. But building a software is not free. So you have to have at least, like I mentioned earlier, $10,000 in funds to be able to get off the ground with a bare bones MVP. So if you don't have that amount, I'll definitely, like I said, do not go ahead and book a call with my team. But if you do, you want to talk about what that might look like for your situation, definitely go ahead and book a call. We're definitely more than happy to talk to you and see how we can help you achieve your software goals.